For decades, historians have wrestled with the idea that the Allies might have mounted a successful invasion of Western Europe in 1943. An invasion of Western Europe had been considered as early as 1943, but the decision to delay the cross-channel operation and conduct the peripheral strategy advocated by the British was perhaps the defining strategic decision of World War II. In hindsight, historical and strategic considerations seem to fully justify postponing the Normandy invasion from 1943 to 1944. Although the potential rewards of a cross-channel invasion in 1943 were significant, it's conceivable that such an operation would have proven premature, exposing Allied forces to unacceptable levels of risk, with an array of potential outcomes that could prove catastrophic. The 1943 cross-channel invasion of the European continent proposed by General Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, and General Marshall, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, attracted support with the plan's straightforward logic. Eisenhower and Marshall developed a plan that would require a concerted effort to determine the nature of the war prior to mobilizing forces. Their two main assumptions dominated their approach. First, it had previously been decided that the European theater would take priority over the Pacific. Second, the initial engagement of the campaign in Europe required a decisive blow against Germany. The timing and location of the invasion therefore became the predominant considerations of American strategy. The American planners argued that Europe's increasingly desperate situation mandated an early cross-channel invasion. Indeed, the Soviet Red Army was in danger of collapse on the Eastern Front. American planners were convinced that opening a second European front offered the best chance to defeat Germany and avoid a protracted war in Europe. The appeal of such a strategy was enhanced by its basis in a distinctly American way of waging war, seizing the offensive, concentrating forces at the decisive place and time, and attacking from a secure base along the shortest lines of communication. The only alternative offered was a British strategy of peripheral, non-decisive operations and slow attrition. Winston Churchill advocated the conduct of such peripheral operations in Africa and the Mediterranean. Both plans were framed in a long debate that rendered them distinct and mutually exclusive. Proponents of a 1943 invasion feared that a peripheral strategy in a non-essential theater would sway the Allies from the war's main strategic objective, which was victory in Europe. They argued that the resulting diversion of crucial resources from a concentrated effort in Europe would, at the very least, prolong the war or cause it to end in a stalemate. Perhaps more scathing and divisive were the allegations of British political opportunism, asserting that the underlying motives for such a strategy were to relieve endangered British colonial enterprises. Most compelling, however, was the argument that prolonging the war in Europe was also synonymous with postponing the war in the Pacific. Taking this passive course was more and more unpalatable to the U.S. Congress and to the people whose memories of Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor were still fresh. These arguments, however, seemed to ignore the Allied concerns that Stalin might accept a separate peace with Germany as Lenin had done in 1917. This possibility provided a dark backdrop for the British and American strategic debate. Since 1942, the Soviets had been urging the British and Americans to open up a second front to relieve their beleaguered armies in the East. If the Soviet Union were to sign a separate peace settlement with Germany, any attempted cross-channel action would be quickly rendered suicidal. Launching the invasion sooner rather than later, the American planners argued, was required to ensure Russia continued to occupy Germany's 157 divisions on the Eastern Front. Delaying a cross-channel invasion would only serve to further alienate the Soviet Union. Churchill argued that an early cross-channel invasion would lead to a, quote, channel full of corpses. The British were well aware of how quickly amphibious operations could go wrong. Although potential rewards of a 1943 cross-channel invasion would have indeed been high, the risks associated with failure would have been catastrophic. If the Allied invading force was defeated or driven back into the sea, it's quite unlikely that another invasion would have been launched for some time. From the British perspective, weakening the German war machine required Allied control of the air and sea. For an invasion to succeed, Churchill believed that accumulating and consolidating Allied resources to close and tighten the ring around Germany along multiple fronts was a vital prerequisite. Through the spring of 1943, the logistical requirements of launching a cross-channel amphibious invasion were not fully understood because an operation of such magnitude had never before been attempted, and much of the required technology did not yet exist. In 1944, shortages of landing craft postponed the Overlord invasion for a month. After the war, Marshall confessed that before 1943, his conception of a landing craft was confined to a rubber boat. Overlord was, in its final form, not an exclusively British or American strategy. It was truly an Allied strategy, coordinated and agreed upon by the British, American, and Soviet leadership. In delaying the 1943 invasion, additional resources and emphasis were devoted to the American effort against Japan. In the spring of 1943, the buildup for a cross-channel attack was far from completion. The majority of U.S. forces had not yet seen combat, and the British Army still had not transitioned to the kind of large-scale operations that a wholesale Allied invasion would require. In retrospect, Operation Torch was an ideal combined training ground for both the British and Americans. Given their collective experience in working together, Torch may have been the only way either country could have effectively conducted offensive operations at such an early stage in the war. Both the Mediterranean and African campaigns successfully diverted German forces from French coastal defenses and provided the Soviets with some relief on the Eastern Front. Today, it is difficult to imagine how a 1943 invasion could have been mounted with any real hope for success. Although plans for an emergency Allied invasion were in place as early as 1942, the requisite skill, power, and political support did not exist for an endeavor of this magnitude until June of 1944.